The ballroom was a sea of shimmering lights and forced laughter. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling like frozen waterfalls, throwing fractured rainbows across the crowd. Everywhere he looked, people were a blur of expensive fabrics and bright white smiles, their voices rising and falling in a familiar corporate rhythm. It was the annual gala, the one night of the year the company spared no expense to celebrate itself, and for him, it felt like standing on the edge of a party he wasn't invited to. He clutched the thin stem of his water glass, the condensation cooling his palm, a small island of reality in a room that felt utterly surreal. He had bought the suit specifically for tonight, a dark, simple charcoal he thought would help him blend in. But now, wearing it, he felt like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The jacket was a little too stiff, the tie a noose he couldn't wait to loosen. He had come with a tiny, foolish spark of hope. This year would be different, he had told himself. He had finished a major project, a complex community center design that had been praised by the clients. He had thought, maybe, this would be the year he would be seen not just as the quiet guy in the corner, but as the capable architect who had earned his place. He had even practiced a few opening lines in the mirror, simple things to say about the weather or the venue. But now, standing here, all those practiced words had evaporated, leaving behind the familiar, hollow silence in his chest. From across the room, a voice boomed, cutting through the low hum of conversation. It was the senior project lead, a man with a wide, easy smile and a voice that carried. He was holding court, as usual, surrounded by a cluster of junior associates who hung on his every word. The lead's eyes scanned the room, a predator looking for its next meal, and they landed with unnerving accuracy on him. "Ah, look everyone. Our resident genius?" The lead called out, a wide grin plastered on his face. A few people turned to look, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Don't wear out the floorboards over there. We need you sharp for Monday's meeting." A ripple of laughter, light and sharp, spread through the group near the lead. He felt a hot flush creep up his neck, a familiar, unwelcome heat. He offered a tight, close-lipped smile and gave a small, jerky nod, hoping that would be the end of it. But it never was. The lead seemed to have a sixth sense for his discomfort and took a strange pleasure in poking at it. "Seriously, though," the lead continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial volume that was still loud enough for half the room to hear, "I was just telling everyone about your brilliant idea for the community center's atrium. Absolutely inspired. Of course, you explained it all in a 3-page email with more diagrams than words? Some of us prefer to use our voices, eh?" Another wave of laughter, this time a little louder, a little more confident. They weren't being cruel, not really. It was just office banter, the kind of thing that was supposed to build camaraderie but only ever built walls around him. He was the punchline to a joke he didn't understand. He took a slow sip of his water, the liquid doing nothing to cool the burning in his throat. He wished he could just disappear, melt into the wallpaper with its generic gold pattern. He watched as his colleagues moved with an easy grace he could never master. They touched each other's arms as they talked, leaned in close, shared knowing glances. They spoke a language of subtle social cues that felt as foreign to him as ancient hieroglyphics. He, on the other hand, communicated in blueprints and clean lines. He could spend hours lost in the perfect angle of a roofline or the way light would filter through a carefully placed window. In his world, everything had a purpose, a logic, a place. But here, in this room, the rules were constantly changing, and he was always a step behind. A woman from the accounting department, whose name he could never remember, drifted past. She was nice enough in a distant sort of way. "You should try the shrimp puffs," she said with a bright, fleeting smile. "They're delicious." Then she was gone, absorbed back into the crowd. It was the kind of small, throwaway comment that was meant to be kind, but it only highlighted his solitude. He wasn't part of a conversation. He was a landmark someone passed on their way to somewhere else. He felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. He decided to move, to find a less exposed spot. He walked slowly along the perimeter of the room, his shoes squeaking softly on the polished marble floor. He tried to look purposeful, as if he were on his way to meet someone, but he knew he just looked lost. He found a spot near a large marble pillar, half hidden by a potted fern. It offered a sliver of privacy, a small shadow where he could stand and just watch. From here, he could see the whole spectacle without being a part of it. He saw the partners from the executive firm, their faces flushed with success and expensive wine. He saw the young interns, trying so hard to mimic the confidence of their superiors, their laughter a little too loud. And he saw the leads still holding court, now telling a story that involved wild hand gestures and a lot of slapping. He thought about the project he had so proudly completed. He remembered the long nights, hunched over his drafting table, the satisfaction of solving a complex structural problem, the quiet joy of seeing the final renderings come to life. That was his world. A world of precision and beauty, where a well-thought-out plan could create something real and lasting. This party, with its noise and its fleeting connections, felt like the exact opposite. It was all surface, no substance. He looked down at his hands, strong and capable from years of drawing and building models. These hands could create a home, a space for people to live and grow. But they felt clumsy and useless when it came to holding a simple conversation or returning a casual handshake. The weight of the evening pressed down on him. The tiny spark of hope he had carried in with him had been extinguished, snuffed out by the lead's easy jokes and the impenetrable wall of social circles. He felt a familiar sense of resignation settle over him. This was just who he was. The outsider. The quiet one. The joke. He finished his water and placed the empty glass on a passing waiter's tray with a silent nod. He was done. He had stayed for an appropriate amount of time. He could go home now, back to his quiet apartment, back to the world where he made sense. He was just trying to figure out the best route to the exit, a path that would involve the least amount of human contact, when his eyes, scanning the room one last time, fell upon it. In a far, forgotten corner, away from the crowds and the noise, sat a grand piano. It was a beautiful, dark wood instrument, gleaming softly under a single spotlight. It was silent, waiting, and for the first time all night, he felt something other than isolation. He felt a pull, a magnetic draw towards the one quiet thing in a room full of meaningless noise. The grand piano sat in the far corner of the ballroom like a forgotten king on an empty throne. It was a world away from the shimmering chaos of the party. A single, soft spotlight bathed it in a warm, golden glow, making the dark, polished wood gleam. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a statement of quiet elegance in a room full of loud opinions. From his hiding spot behind the potted fern, he couldn't take his eyes off it. It was an island of silence in a sea of noise, and he felt a pull towards it that was stronger than anything he had felt all night. It was as if the piano was calling to him, a kindred spirit whispering that he wasn't the only one who didn't belong. He remembered his grandmother's old upright piano, the one that sat in her dusty living room, always slightly out of tune. It was the first thing he had ever truly connected with. As a small, quiet boy, he would spend hours at her side, his small fingers struggling to reach the keys, while she taught him the language of music. She never told him to speak up or to be more like the other kids. She just let him play. "The piano doesn't care if you're popular," she used to say, her voice soft and wrinkly like a fallen leaf. "It only cares if you mean it." That piano had been his sanctuary, the one place where his quietness wasn't a flaw, but a strength. It was where he learned that feelings he couldn't put into words could flow out through his fingertips, creating melodies that were more honest than any sentence he could ever speak. He hadn't played seriously in years. Life had gotten in the way. College, then the demanding hours of his first job, the long nights spent hunched over drafting tables. The music got packed away, along with other parts of his childhood he thought he had outgrown. But looking at that grand piano now, he felt a pang of longing so sharp it almost hurt. It was a longing for that feeling of pure, unjudged expression. He imagined the feel of the cool keys under his fingers, the way the sound would vibrate through the wood and up into his bones. He could almost hear a melody in his head, a sad, beautiful tune that matched the mood of the evening. Just then, a couple stumbled past his pillar, laughing loudly. The man, a junior executive from another department, bumped into him hard enough to make him take a step back. "Whoa, watch out there, pal," the man said, not even looking at him. His apology was an accusation. He watched them weave away, their arms wrapped around each other, and felt the familiar sting of being invisible. He wasn't a person to them. He was just an obstacle in their path. He took a deep breath, trying to push down the wave of bitterness that rose in his throat. He was used to it. It was the story of his life. But tonight it felt heavier, more insulting. He turned his gaze back to the piano. The professional pianist who had been playing earlier was now at the bar, sipping a drink and chatting with a waitress. The piano was alone, unclaimed. The thought that had been simmering in the back of his mind began to bubble to the surface. It was a reckless, foolish, utterly terrifying thought. Asterisk, what if I just went over there and played? Asterisk, the idea was so absurd it almost made him laugh out loud. Him? Play in front of all these people? The same people who saw him as a joke? A walking diagram? He could just imagine the scene. He would sit down, fumble with the keys, and a few clumsy, wrong notes would echo through the ballroom. The lead's voice would boom out, "Well, looks like our genius has another hidden talent." A terrible one. The room would erupt in laughter, and this time it wouldn't be a gentle ripple. It would be a roar. He would be the biggest joke of the night, the story they would tell for years to come. His hands felt sweaty just thinking about it. He wiped them on his stiff trousers, his heart starting to beat a little faster, but then another thought, a quieter one, pushed back. Asterisk, what if you didn't play for them? This voice was softer, more like his grandmother's. Asterisk, what if you just played for the piano? What if you just played for yourself? He didn't have to be a virtuoso. He didn't have to impress anyone. He could just sit down and let his fingers remember what it felt like to speak that old, beautiful language. He could close his eyes and pretend he was back in his grandmother's living room with the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. He could play for the lonely little boy he used to be, the one who found a friend in 88 black and white keys. He stood there, torn in two. The fear was a physical thing, a tight knot in his stomach. It told him to stay safe, to stay hidden, to finish his water and go home like he planned. But the longing was a gentle, persistent pull, a current trying to draw him out to sea. It promised him something more than safety. It promised him a moment of peace, a moment of authenticity in a night that felt completely fake. As he was debating, a woman from marketing whom he vaguely recognized walked by. She was one of those people who was always relentlessly cheerful. "Having a good time?" she asked, her smile so bright it almost hurt his eyes. He just nodded, not trusting his voice. "You know," she said, leaning in conspiratorially, "you should really try to mingle more. People think you're a bit standoffish." She said it as if she was giving him a helpful piece of advice, a friendly tip. But the word standoffish hit him like a slap. It wasn't the first time he had heard it. It was the nice way people said weird or arrogant. They saw his quietness not as shyness but as a judgment on them. They thought he was better than them, when in reality he felt like he was worse than everyone. The comment was the final push. The knot in his stomach tightened, and then, strangely, it began to loosen. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a new feeling, defiance. He was tired of being misunderstood. He was tired of being a punchline. He was tired of trying to fit into a world that didn't have a place for him. He didn't want to mingle. He didn't want to make small talk about the weather. He wanted to do something real. He looked back at the piano. It was still there, waiting, silent, patient. It wasn't judging him. It was just offering him a chance to speak. He made a decision. It wasn't a grand, heroic decision. It was a small, quiet, desperate one. He wasn't doing it to change their minds about him. He was doing it to save himself. He was drowning in their noise. And the piano was his only life raft. He pushed himself away from the pillar and started walking. Each step felt like a monumental effort. The marble floor seemed to stretch on forever. The sounds of the party, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the low hum of 100 conversations seemed to get louder, more intense. He felt like a spotlight was following him, even though he knew no one was really paying attention. He kept his eyes fixed on the piano, his goal, his sanctuary. He walked past tables laden with food he hadn't touched, past groups of people who were too absorbed in their own worlds to notice him. He was a ghost on a mission. Finally, he reached the corner. The air here seemed different, calmer. The professional pianist glanced over at him, a curious look on his face, but then turned back to his drink. He stood before the piano for a long moment, just looking at it. Up close, it was even more beautiful. He could see the detailed grain of the wood, the perfect reflection of the spotlight on the polished lid. It looked like it had been waiting just for him. He reached out and slowly ran a hand along the smooth, cool wood of the side. A shiver went through him. This was real. He was really going to do this. He pulled out the adjustable bench, the scrape of its metal legs against the floor sounding unnaturally loud in his own ears. He sat down, the firmness of the bench a familiar comfort. He looked at the keys, a perfect landscape of black and white. They were clean, cool, and inviting. He placed his fingers on them, his right hand hovering over C, his left finding a familiar chord position. He closed his eyes, took one last, deep breath, and let the world fall away. There was only him and the piano and the music waiting to be born. The world did not go silent just because he sat down. For a moment, the noise of the party was a physical force, a wall of sound pressing in on him from all sides. The clinking of glasses was like tiny, sharp hammers. The bursts of laughter were like cracks of thunder. The low, constant hum of 100 conversations was a thick, heavy fog. He sat on the bench, his fingers resting on the cool, smooth ivory of the keys, and felt a wave of doubt so strong it almost made him stand up and walk away. What was he doing? This was a terrible idea. He was an architect, not a performer. He built things with lines and measurements. He didn't create magic out of thin air. He took a slow, deep breath, the way his grandmother had taught him to before a difficult piece. "Breathe with the music," she would say. "Let the air be the first note." He closed his eyes, shutting out the glittering lights and the sea of unfamiliar faces. He focused on the feeling of the keys beneath his fingertips, the solid, dependable presence of the piano. He wasn't in a ballroom anymore. He was in a small, quiet space, just him and 88 friends who were waiting to hear what he had to say, his right thumb, feeling a little shaky, pressed down on a single key. A C. It was a simple, clean note, but in the noisy room it landed like a drop of water in a silent desert. It was small, but it was pure. It cut through the fog of chatter with a clarity that was startling. He held the note for a second, letting it hang in the air, a tiny, perfect sphere of sound. Then his other fingers joined in, not in a rush, but one by one, as if they were waking up from a long sleep. He began to play the opening bars of a melody he knew better than his own name. A sad and beautiful piece he had learned as a boy. It wasn't a song anyone would dance to. It wasn't a popular tune they would recognize from the radio. It was a quiet, complicated conversation between the notes. It started out soft and questioning, like someone searching for something they had lost. The melody was a long, winding line of notes that flowed like a river in the moonlight. It was the sound of loneliness, but not a desperate loneliness. It was a peaceful, accepting loneliness, the kind you feel when you're walking alone at night and are content with just your own thoughts. At first, no one really noticed. A few heads turned in his direction, drawn by the unexpected sound, but then they turned back to their conversations. The music was just background noise, a change from the generic jazz the hired pianist had been playing earlier. But then something began to happen. The melody started to weave itself into the fabric of the room. It was insistent but gentle. It didn't demand attention, but it earned it. A woman standing near the bar, who had been laughing loudly at a story, stopped mid-sentence. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of gentle curiosity. She turned her head fully towards the corner, her eyes trying to find the source of the sound. A small group of men in expensive suits, who were debating something with passionate gestures, gradually fell silent. Their hands dropped to their sides. Their heads turned, almost in unison, towards the piano. It was like watching a ripple spread across a pond. One person would stop and listen, and then the person next to them would notice, and then the next. He wasn't aware of this. His eyes were still closed. He was no longer in the ballroom. He was back in his grandmother's dusty living room, the smell of old books and lavender in the air. He could feel her presence beside him, her hand on his shoulder, a gentle, encouraging weight. He was playing for her. He was playing for the quiet, lonely boy he used to be, the boy who found it easier to talk to a piano than to people. The music was his apology to that boy, his promise to him that he hadn't forgotten him. As he played, the music began to change. The initial quiet questioning gave way to a more confident, flowing melody. His fingers, which had felt stiff and unsure at first, began to move with a memory of their own. They danced across the keys, finding the notes with an easy grace that surprised even him. He wasn't thinking about what he was playing. The music was just flowing through him, a current of emotion that had been dammed up for years. The left hand joined in, adding a deep, resonant harmony that gave the melody a new depth, a new sadness. It was the sound of regret, of missed opportunities, of words left unsaid. It was the feeling he had when the senior colleague had made a joke of him, the hot flush of shame that he could never express. He poured all of it into the music. Every moment of feeling invisible, every awkward silence, every forced smile. It was all there, in the space between the notes. The room was now almost completely silent. The only sounds were the music pouring from the piano and the soft, collective breathing of 100 people who had forgotten they were at a party. Waiters had stopped in their tracks, holding trays of champagne flutes like statues. The clinking of ice in glasses had ceased. The low hum of conversation had been replaced by a profound, attentive silence. People were not just listening. They were feeling. The music was reaching into their chests and touching something they had forgotten was there. The senior colleague, the one with the booming voice, was standing with his mouth slightly open. The glass of whiskey in his hand was forgotten. The circle of admirers who had been hanging on his every word had dispersed, their faces now turned towards the quiet man in the corner. The lead's smug confidence had been replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. He was looking at the man he had called a joke, and for the first time he was seeing him. Really seeing him. The music swelled, growing louder and more passionate. It was no longer a quiet, sad river. It was a stormy sea, full of crashing waves and deep, powerful currents. His fingers moved faster, the notes tumbling over each other in a cascade of sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was the sound of defiance, of a soul breaking free from its cage. It was all the anger and frustration he had kept locked away for years, finally being given a voice. He wasn't just playing the piano anymore. He was fighting a battle with the notes, and he was winning. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The music softened again, returning to the gentle, flowing melody from the beginning. But it was different now. It wasn't just sad. It was hopeful. It was the sound of finding peace after a long struggle. It was the feeling of the sun breaking through the clouds after a week of rain. It was a promise that even after the darkest night, the morning would come. He played the final chord, a series of notes that hung in the air like a benediction. He held his hands on the keys, letting the sound fade into a profound, breathtaking silence. The last note seemed to vibrate in the air for an eternity, a tiny, perfect echo of the journey they had all just taken. He slowly opened his eyes, the spell broken. He was back in the ballroom, and the entire room was looking at him. The silence that followed the last note was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full one, heavy with the weight of the melody that had just filled the room. It was a shared silence, a moment where 100 strangers were all thinking the same thing, even if they couldn't put it into words. He sat frozen, his fingers still resting on the keys, his eyes wide open now, taking in the scene before him. Every face in the ballroom was turned towards him. The smug smiles were gone. The bored expressions had vanished. In their place was a look of collective awe, a kind of soft, open vulnerability that he had never seen in this room before. He felt exposed, like a specimen under a microscope, and a hot wave of panic began to rise in his chest. He had done it. He had played his heart out, and now there were consequences. Then someone in the back started clapping. It was a single pair of hands at first, slow and deliberate. Then another joined and another. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping you hear after a CEO's speech. It built quickly, growing in speed and volume, until it erupted into a thunderous roar that shook the crystal chandeliers. It was a wall of sound, a wave of appreciation so loud it was almost physical. People were on their feet, their faces flushed with emotion. They weren't just clapping for a song. They were clapping for the feeling, for the story, for the unexpected glimpse into a soul they hadn't known existed. He saw the woman from marketing, the one who called him standoffish, with tears in her eyes. He saw a junior partner, a man who had never once spoken to him, clapping with such enthusiasm that his hands were red. The sound was overwhelming. He didn't know how to react. He wasn't a rock star. He didn't have a bow or a witty remark. He was just a man who had played a piano. His first instinct, his most powerful instinct, was to run. He wanted to shrink away, to slide off the bench and crawl under the piano and hide until everyone went home. The attention was a physical pressure, and he felt like he couldn't breathe under its weight. He quickly pulled his hands from the keys as if they were hot and stood up, the bench scraping loudly against the floor. He gave a jerky, awkward nod towards the room, a gesture that was meant to say, "Thank you," but probably just looked like a nervous twitch. He started to move away from the piano, hoping to make a quick escape to the exit. But the crowd parted for him, and as he walked, people reached out to him. A hand touched his arm. That was, I have no words, a man from accounting said, his eyes wide with sincerity. He just nodded, unable to find his own voice. Where did you learn to play like that? A young intern asked, her face full of wonder. He just shrugged and mumbled something about his grandmother, his voice barely a whisper. He felt like a fraud, accepting praise for something he didn't feel he owned. Something that had just flowed through him as he navigated through the sea of faces. He saw the senior colleague standing near the bar. The man was no longer holding court. His group had dispersed, and he was standing alone, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked smaller, less imposing. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, the protagonist felt a flicker of his old fear, the familiar dread of being the target of the man's easy cruelty. He braced himself for a sarcastic comment, a backhanded compliment that would put him back in his place, but the comment never came. As he got closer, the senior colleague just watched him, his expression unreadable. There was no smugness, no anger, just a deep, profound bewilderment. It was as if the man was trying to solve a puzzle, and the protagonist was the missing piece he had just found. When he was just a few feet away, the colleague spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual booming confidence. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I didn't see that one coming." He paused, looking down into his glass. "You play." "Very well." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even particularly friendly. But it was the closest thing to an admission of defeat he would ever get from this man. It was a surrender. In that moment, the power dynamic that had defined their entire relationship shattered into a million pieces. He didn't need to say anything in return. He just looked the man in the eye, a calm, steady gaze he had never been able to manage before. He gave a small, simple nod of acknowledgement, and then continued walking. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt seen for the first time. The man saw him, not as a joke or a quiet oddity, but as a person with a depth he couldn't comprehend. Just before he reached the exit, a firm hand clapped him on the shoulder. He turned to see the head of the firm, a man who was usually surrounded by an impenetrable wall of importance. The boss's face was serious, but his eyes held a new light, a spark of genuine respect. "Son," he said, his voice low and gruff. "That was something else. Truly something else." He held out his hand, and the protagonist shook it, the grip firm and surprisingly warm. "We build buildings of steel and glass," the boss continued, looking past him for a moment towards the empty piano. "But tonight you built something else entirely. Good for you." With another firm pat on the shoulder, he was gone, leaving the protagonist standing by the door. His hand still tingling from the handshake, he finally pushed through the heavy doors. and stepped out into the cool night air. The city sounds seemed distant and muffled. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh, cold air, and it felt like the first real breath he had taken all night. He didn't wait for a cab. He just started walking, his dress shoes scuffing on the pavement. The streets were a blur of neon lights and shadows. He didn't have a destination in mind. He just needed to move, to process the seismic shift that had just occurred in his life. He thought about the faces in the crowd, the looks of shock and admiration. He thought about the senior colleague's quiet concession. He thought about the boss's firm handshake. But mostly, he thought about the music. He hadn't played it for them. He hadn't played it to prove them wrong or to show them up. He had played it for himself, of the lonely boy he once was, for the grandmother who had taught him that the piano didn't care if you were popular. He had played it because the noise in his head had become too loud, and the music was the only thing that could quiet it, and in doing so, in that one act of pure, unselfish expression, he had accidentally changed everything. He was no longer the joke of the corporate party. He was the man who played the piano. He was the architect who could build castles in the air with nothing but 88 keys. He was still quiet, still a little awkward, still more comfortable with blueprints than small talk. But he was no longer invisible. He had been seen, and he could never go back to being a ghost. The joke was over, and as he walked through the sleeping city, a small, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time that night. The walk back to his apartment was a long, slow meditation. The city, usually a blur of overwhelming noise and light, seemed to have softened. The wail of a distant siren sounded less like an alarm and more like a lonely song. The rumble of the subway beneath his feet felt like a steady, reassuring heartbeat. He kept his hands in his pockets, his right thumb gently stroking the fingertips of his left hand, as if trying to remember the feel of the keys. He replayed the evening in his mind, not the awkward beginning, but the silent, rapturous middle. He saw the faces turned towards him, not with judgment, but with a shared, unspoken understanding. He wasn't used to being the center of anything, and the feeling was both terrifying and intoxicating. By the time he reached his building, his initial panic had been replaced by a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion. He fell into bed without even changing out of his suit, the scratchy wool a strange comfort against his skin, and slept for the first time in months without a single diagram or floor plan floating through his dreams. The next morning, the reality of what he had done came crashing back. The alarm blared, and he hit the snooze button, a familiar dread coiling in his stomach. The party wasn't a dream. The music, the applause, the looks on their faces, it had all happened. And now he had to go back. He had to walk into that office and face the aftermath. He went through his morning routine on autopilot, the taste of toast like ash in his mouth. Every possible scenario played out in his head. Maybe they would all pretend it never happened. That would be the worst, a silent agreement that his moment of brilliance was an embarrassing anomaly. Or maybe they would treat him like some kind of circus act, asking him to play the funny song on the office keyboard. The knot of anxiety in his stomach tightened with each step. He took towards the office building. He pushed through the glass doors and braced himself. The lobby was bustling with the usual morning rush. He kept his head down, making a beeline for the elevators, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He just needed to get to his desk, to the familiar safety of his drafting table and his blueprints. As he waited for the elevator doors to open, a voice called his name. It was the woman from accounting. He froze, his back to her, expecting another well-meaning but painful comment. "Hey," she said, walking up to stand beside him. "I just wanted to say, last night was really special. My mom used to play the piano. It reminded me of her." She gave him a small, genuine smile, not of pity, but of shared memory. It was beautiful. He just nodded, not trusting his voice. But the knot in his stomach loosened just a fraction. The elevator ride was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. No one was pointedly ignoring him. A few people gave him small, respectful nods. It was as if he had been initiated into a secret club, one where membership was granted not through loud jokes or sharp suits, but through a moment of raw honesty. When he reached his floor, the atmosphere felt different. The usual competitive buzz was replaced by a calmer, more focused energy. He walked to his desk, his eyes fixed forward, but he could feel the glances. They weren't looks of mockery. They were looks of curiosity, of reassessment. He was just settling into his chair, pulling up the schematics for the community center, when a shadow fell over his desk. He looked up to see the senior colleague standing there. The man's hands were shoved in his pockets, a posture he had never seen him in before. He looked uncomfortable, almost unsure of himself. The protagonist felt the old fear flare up, a conditioned response. He braced for the sarcastic remark, the public belittling. But the colleague just stood there for a moment, clearing his throat. "Listen," he began, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. "About the atrium for the community center. The clients they're having second thoughts about the glass roof. They're worried about the maintenance costs." He paused, looking down at the protagonist's desk, at the neat rows of pens and the precise drawings. "I've been trying to come up with an alternative all morning, but everything looks clunky. I need a fresh perspective." "I need your perspective." The words hung in the air, more shocking than any insult could have been. The senior project lead, the man who had publicly mocked his methods, was asking for his help. He wasn't just asking. He was admitting defeat. He was acknowledging that the protagonist's way of seeing things, his quiet, methodical approach, had a value his own loud charisma could not match. The protagonist looked at the man, really looked at him, and for the first time, he didn't see an adversary. He just saw another person stuck on a problem. "I'll take a look," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The relief on the colleague's face was palpable. "Thanks," the man said, and then he turned and walked away, leaving the protagonist sitting in a state of mild shock. An hour later, an email popped up on his screen. It was from the head of the firm's personal assistant. "The boss would like to see you in his office. Please come up at your earliest convenience." His heart skipped a beat. Was he in trouble? Had he crossed some line by playing the piano? He took a deep breath, remembered the feeling of the keys under his fingers, and stood up. He walked to the executive floor, his steps more confident than they had been that morning. The boss's office was huge, with a wall of windows overlooking the entire city. The boss was standing by the window, his back to the door. "Come in," he said, without turning around. The protagonist stood silently, waiting. Finally, the boss turned. He had a rolled-up blueprint in his hand. "Last night," the boss began, his voice gruff but not unkind, "you reminded me of something important." He unrolled the blueprint on his large mahogany desk. It was a design for a new city library, a project the firm had been trying to win for months. "We build structures," the boss said, pointing to the blueprint. "Steel, glass, concrete. They're functional. They're strong. But they don't have a soul. Last night you didn't just play notes. You built something with sound. You built a feeling." He looked the protagonist straight in the eye. "This library project. The city board wants something more than just a building. They want a landmark. They want a place that inspires people. My team has given them a dozen solid, practical designs, and they've rejected all of them." He pushed the blueprint across the desk. "I want you to look at this. I don't want you to think like an architect. I want you to think like a musician. Show us something they can feel." He left the boss's office in a daze, the heavy roll of blueprints feeling light as a feather in his hands. He went back to his desk, but he didn't unroll the plans right away. He just sat there, looking out his own small window at the city below. He was still the same quiet, awkward man who had walked into the office that morning. He still preferred the company of blueprints to people. But something fundamental had shifted. The world hadn't changed, but his place in it had. He no longer felt like an outsider looking in. He was a part of things, but on his own terms. His quietness wasn't a weakness. It was a space where he could hear things other people couldn't. His difference wasn't a flaw. It was his strength. That evening, after everyone else had gone home, he stayed late. He didn't look at the library plans. Instead, he went online and found a website for used musical instruments. He scrolled through the listings, his fingers tracing the outline of the keyboards on the screen. He found a simple, used digital piano, not fancy, but with weighted keys that would feel like the real thing. He clicked Buy Now without a second thought. He wasn't buying it to perform for anyone. He was buying it for the same reason he had become an architect, to build a world for himself, a quiet, beautiful world of lines and melodies where he always belonged. The joke was truly over, and in its place was a simple, profound, and silent symphony of self-acceptance.